If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. The flight disappears from the sky. The afternoon sun beat down on eastern Ukraine as flight MH17 cruised at 33,000 feet. Below, a war raged between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists. The Boeing 777 carried 298 souls from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, following a route dozens of aircraft had taken that same week. Air traffic controllers in Dnipro watched the familiar blip move across their screens. Everything appeared normal. The pilot had requested to climb higher due to weather, but stayed at the assigned altitude when told the next level was occupied. Radio chatter remained routine. Then, at 13:20 GMT, something went terribly wrong. The radar signature vanished instantly. No distress call, no emergency beacon. The aircraft simply disappeared from the sky, as if erased by an invisible hand. Controllers stared at blank screens, where moments before a commercial airliner had been flying safely through international airspace. Panic spread through the control room. Operators frantically tried to re-establish contact. Malaysian 17, Dnipro Control, do you read? Silence filled their headsets. They checked equipment, reset systems, and called other radar stations. Nothing. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the ground. Social media posts began appearing from the conflict zone below. Videos showed a massive plume of black smoke rising from sunflower fields near the village of Wreckage. Local residents reported a thunderous explosion that shook their homes and sent debris raining from the sky. The first fragments told a horrifying story. Twisted metal scattered across miles of farmland. Personal belongings lay among the wreckage. Passports, luggage, and seats had fallen like deadly confetti across the countryside. Within hours, different stories emerged from the war zone. Ukrainian officials claimed rebels had shot down a civilian aircraft using sophisticated weapons. Separatist leaders initially celebrated what they thought was a Ukrainian military plane, then quickly deleted their social media posts when reports confirmed it was a passenger jet. Russia pointed fingers at Ukraine. Ukraine blamed Russian-backed forces. Each side presented evidence that seemed to support their version of events. Audio recordings surfaced of alleged rebel communications, but their authenticity remained disputed. International investigators faced an impossible task. The crash site lay in active combat territory controlled by armed groups. Evidence could be compromised or destroyed. Witnesses might fear speaking truthfully. The complexity of the situation created perfect conditions for conspiracy theories to flourish. Families of the victims waited desperately for answers. Government officials held emergency meetings. Airlines began avoiding Ukrainian airspace entirely. The world demanded to know who was responsible for this tragedy. But in eastern Ukraine, where truth often becomes the first casualty of war, finding those answers would prove far more difficult than anyone imagined. The wreckage and the first accusations. The morning after changed everything. Where sunflower fields once swayed peacefully near Grabovo, twisted metal now lay scattered like broken promises. The Boeing 777 had shattered into thousands of pieces across 15 square miles of Ukrainian countryside. Local farmers found seat cushions in their gardens. Children's toys hung from tree branches. Passports fluttered in the wind like autumn leaves. The scene was beyond imagination. Bodies still strapped to seats had fallen into wheat fields. Personal belongings told stories of interrupted lives. Wedding rings, family photos, half-finished books. But this was no ordinary crash site. Grabovo sat in the heart of a war zone where bullets flew daily between Ukrainian soldiers and pro-Russian separatists. Armed men in mismatched uniforms controlled the roads. They decided who could enter and who had to leave. International investigators tried to reach the wreckage, but roadblocks stopped them at every turn. Men with rifles shook their heads. No access today, maybe tomorrow. The crash site remained unguarded for hours, then days. Local residents walked through the debris. Some took pieces as souvenirs. Evidence disappeared into pockets and homes. Television cameras captured the chaos. Images of the destruction spread across the world in minutes. Social media exploded with photos and theories. Everyone had an opinion about what happened. The blame game started before the fire stopped burning. Ukrainian officials pointed fingers at separatist fighters. They claimed rebels had shot down the plane by mistake, thinking it was a military transport. Radio conversations surfaced online. Voices spoke in Russian about bringing down an aircraft. The recordings seemed damning. Russia fired back immediately. Officials in Moscow denied everything. They suggested Ukraine's own forces were responsible. Maybe it was an accident during military exercises. Perhaps someone wanted to frame the separatists. The stories changed by the hour. Western leaders demanded answers. They called for immediate access to the crash site. European politicians spoke of justice and accountability. American officials hinted at sanctions. The diplomatic temperature rose with each passing hour. But in the fields around Grabovo, the truth lay buried under politics and propaganda. Body parts mixed with aircraft fragments. Personal effects scattered in the mud told their own story of sudden death at 33,000 feet. The separatist commander, known as Igor the Terrible, controlled the area. He granted interviews to selected journalists while keeping investigators at bay. His men searched through the wreckage, claiming to look for the black boxes. Many suspected they were removing evidence instead. 300 innocent people had vanished from the sky. Now their story became ammunition in someone else's war. The missile theory emerges. The first clues whispered their secrets through twisted metal fragments scattered across Ukrainian farmland. Dutch investigators bent over tiny pieces of aircraft skin, their magnifying glasses catching the morning sun. What they found made their blood run cold. The metal told a story. Thousands of small holes peppered the cockpit sections like deadly confetti. Each hole measured exactly the same size. The pattern was too perfect to be random, too precise to be accidental. In a sterile laboratory in the Netherlands, forensic experts laid out the debris like puzzle pieces. Under powerful microscopes, they discovered something chilling. Embedded in the aluminum were tiny bow-tie-shaped fragments. These weren't ordinary pieces of metal. They were designed to kill. The fragments matched only one weapon system. The Buk surface-to-air missile carried warheads packed with these distinctive pieces. When the missile exploded, it sprayed thousands of these deadly fragments in all directions. The evidence was staring them in the face. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies across Europe were listening to recorded phone calls. Russian separatists bragged about shooting down what they thought was a Ukrainian military plane. The voices were clear. The conversations were damning. One caller even mentioned seeing a Buk launcher moving through rebel territory just hours before MH17 fell from the sky. Satellite images revealed more secrets. Photos showed a Buk missile system crossing the Russian border into Ukraine the day before the attack. The same system appeared to return to Russia the next morning, missing one of its 4 missiles. Radar data from multiple sources painted the final picture. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly as Flight MH17 simply vanished from their screens. No distress call, no warning. One moment the plane was there, flying peacefully at 33,000 feet. The next moment, it was gone. The Dutch Safety Board faced an impossible task. They had to piece together what happened in those final seconds. The black box recordings captured the crew's last moments. The pilots were chatting normally when a massive explosion tore through their aircraft. The recording ended instantly, but not everyone accepted these findings. Russian officials fired back with their own theories. They claimed Ukrainian fighter jets shot down the plane. They suggested the CIA orchestrated the attack. Each denial grew more desperate as the evidence mounted against them. Social media posts from rebel fighters began disappearing. Photos of book launchers vanished from websites. Audio recordings were denied or called fake. The cover-up was happening in real time, visible to anyone watching carefully. The truth seemed clear to investigators, but the political storm was just beginning. Someone had fired a Russian-made missile at a passenger plane. The question remained, who gave the order? Conspiracy shadows and alternative theories. The official story seemed clear enough, but within hours of MH17's wreckage hitting the ground, other voices began whispering different tales. Moscow's media painted a striking picture. Ukrainian fighter jets had stalked the passenger plane, they claimed. Military radar showed suspicious aircraft nearby. Why would Ukraine shoot down a civilian flight over its own territory? The answer, according to Russian sources, was simple: to blame Russia and gain worldwide sympathy. These weren't random internet theories. State television broadcasters presented satellite images showing Ukrainian jets. Military experts appeared on screen, pointing to radar traces. The presentation looked professional, official, but something felt wrong to outside observers. Western investigators pushed back hard. They released their own evidence, phone calls between rebel commanders, intercepted messages about moving missile systems, social media posts that vanished after the crash. Each piece seemed to point toward a Russian-supplied weapon. Yet the competing narratives only grew stronger. Some claimed the whole tragedy was planned from the start, a false flag operation designed to trigger international conflict. Others suggested the plane was shot down by mistake, then covered up by desperate officials. Wild theories spread about switched aircraft and planted evidence. The internet became a battlefield of competing truths. Leaked documents appeared overnight, then disappeared just as quickly. Anonymous sources shared contradictory information. Each side accused the other of manufacturing evidence. Forensic experts found themselves defending basic scientific methods. Pixel analysis of satellite photos became front-page news. The angle of shrapnel holes turned into political statements. Even the victims' belongings were scrutinized for hidden clues. Russian media highlighted every inconsistency in the official investigation. Why were certain areas restricted? Who controlled the crash site initially? These questions seemed reasonable on the surface. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials released phone recordings of rebel fighters discussing their missile systems. But critics questioned the authenticity. Voice analysis became another contested battlefield. Nothing was accepted at face value anymore. The tragedy transformed into something larger than the loss of 298 lives. Each government used the disaster to advance its own narrative. Truth became secondary to political advantage. International observers watched this information war with growing concern. How could facts be established when every piece of evidence was immediately challenged? The crash site itself remained contested territory for weeks, making independent verification nearly impossible. Years later, these competing stories continue to circulate. Social media amplifies every theory. New supposed evidence appears regularly, keeping the controversy alive. The families of victims remain caught between warring versions of their loved ones' final moments. The question persists. In a world where every fact can be disputed, how do we separate truth from carefully constructed lies? Trials, evidence, and lingering uncertainty. The courtroom in The Hague fell silent as prosecutors presented their evidence. 5 years had passed since MH17 crashed into those Ukrainian fields. Now, the world would finally hear what investigators had discovered. 4 men sat accused of murder, 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian. Their names appeared on documents found in rebel strongholds. Phone calls had been recorded. Satellite images showed missile launchers moving through the countryside. The evidence seemed clear, but the suspects were nowhere to be found. Russia refused to hand over its citizens. The men remained free, hiding behind borders that international law could not cross. The trial would proceed without them, their empty chairs telling their own story about justice delayed. Witnesses stepped forward with trembling voices. Some had seen the missile system that morning. Others heard the commanders giving orders over radio. A few brave souls had photographed military equipment being moved under cover of darkness. Each testimony added another piece to a puzzle that grew more complex with every revelation. The defense lawyers argued fiercely. They questioned every satellite photo, every phone recording, every witness statement. How could anyone be certain which missile fired the fatal shot? How could investigators prove beyond doubt who gave the final order? The questions hung heavy in the air like smoke. Investigators admitted their limitations openly. Key witnesses had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Critical evidence remained locked away in Russian archives. Some phone calls had been erased before they could be captured. The truth had gaps that might never be filled. In November 2022, the verdict arrived. 3 men were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The court declared that Russia had provided the weapon and the training. The missile came from a Russian military base. The chain of command led back to Moscow itself. But questions remained. Who really made the decision to shoot? Was it chaos on the battlefield or a calculated choice? Did Russian officials know civilian aircraft flew overhead? The answers stayed buried in classified files and protected testimonies. The families of the victims wept as they heard the verdict. Justice had been served on paper, yet the guilty men walked free in their homeland. The court could name them, shame them, and sentence them, but it could not reach across borders to make them pay. Today, MH17 remains a wound that refuses to heal. The official story points to Russia, but Moscow denies everything. Propaganda machines churn out alternative theories. Social media spreads doubt faster than facts can be verified. The truth exists somewhere in the shadows between what we know and what we can prove. Perhaps that is the most unsettling mystery of all.